Can you hear me now? I don't even have to yell. Is that better? Okay. I'd like to thank all of you who are students and local community members for joining us this evening. I'd also like to take a moment, and I see Jim in the back here, from Tiller LLC and WSHU Public Radio for their support of this series. Thank you so much for what you've done to support us. You can learn more about both organizations and see our full lineup of My Life as speakers for this semester on our website, stonybrook.edu/journalism. Tonight, we are pleased to welcome Joel Weber, editor of Bloomberg Businessweek, one of the leading brands in business journalism. Joel was named editor of Businessweek in January 2018, and we had you visit a business journalism class today, and I think it was a smashing success, so you'll get to hear from Joel in a moment. He joined Bloomberg in 2012 as senior editor at Bloomberg Markets magazine, covering banking, finance, economics, and technology. Before Bloomberg, Joel worked at ESPN, the magazine Men's Health, Best Life, and Men's Journal. He has helped win 2 national magazine awards, has been a finalist for another, and co-authored the Men's Health Big Book of Food and Nutrition. We are also excited to have Stony Brook University graduate Mike Dukmajian, who will join Joel in a conversation about Joel's vision for the industry, his career, and issues facing business journalism. Mike, it's always fun to have you come back to campus, and I get to hear stories about life way back when, right? Mike is an alum of Bloomberg Media and currently serves as Chief Revenue Officer of Loeb Enterprises. He is also a member of our School of Journalism Professional Advisory Board, and we would like to thank him for his continued support of our school. You've heard enough from me. Let's get Joel and Mike up here. This should be a fun evening. Where should I put the mic?
Can you hear me?
How about me?
Stony Brook.
There we go.
Seawolves. Right?
What is a
What,
sea?
yeah,
what is a
I
sea-
was getting, what is a seawolf? That's. Okay. Timberwolves, yes. But thank you all. This is a treat. Joel and I have spent years together in business, and we've done this a few times, so we'll just get right to it, Joel, right? We're going to make this
I'm ready.
interesting and fun.
I know there's mics, and there for you to be able to ask questions, so please be thinking about them. This is, I'm honored to be here, and whatever insights I can possibly give you, we'll try and do our best up here, but if you have other questions, please use the mics to ask them.
Okay, so we'll get right into it. What is it like to work for Mike Bloomberg, the 12th richest man in the world?
I actually don't know if he's the 12th richest guy in the world or not. We're not able to report on his wealth. So we know a lot of other people and how wealthy they are, but I actually can't tell you if he's the 12th richest guy in the world. What I can tell you is he's actually an incredible entrepreneur. That the company is one of these places where like the founder is still in charge. And there's a lot of talk within business and companies about being able to be a purpose-driven organization. It's a little disconcerting. If that keeps going, I'll switch to that. We good? Okay. That at the end of the day, one of the things that I think distinguishes Bloomberg from other companies and other media organizations is Mike gives all of his money away via Bloomberg Philanthropies. So when I go to work and bust my rear end week in, week out, it's actually for a cause that I believe in, because Mike's causes are publicly known. They're part of Bloomberg Philanthropies. They're causes I believe in, and he just keeps writing checks day in, day out. And I think that there's this trickle-down effect that has throughout the organization that really allows us to compete on a different level than a lot of other companies that are either publicly traded or have different ownership models. It all comes back to Mike. He can cut through BS like a hot knife through butter. When you have interactions with him, it's just like he's thinking 3 steps ahead of you all the time. And that's an amazing leader to learn from. So I've been honored and blessed to have that opportunity.
What was the first thing when he gave you the job to become editor of Bloomberg Businessweek?
So he didn't give it to me, but he has a line that he likes to give many people. So I was not the first to hear it, which is, "Don't fuck it up."
That's what Mike says to everybody in every job.
Like I said, cutting through butter like a hot knife.
Yeah. Like a drunken sailor.
Or that,
language.
yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, okay. Tell us a little bit about what it's like to be an editor of a major business publication medium.
So Bloomberg Businessweek, as the name implies, is a weekly. We're still in print. We do a lot more than that. I think of it as a brand. When I took over, it was mostly print, and we've really tried to grow that expression because we feel like we have a lens that complements Bloomberg and Bloomberg News, but isn't the same thing as news. News is happening constantly. And Bloomberg News is very good at covering breaking news, especially. But we think that there's still a white space in business news, and actually I think in journalism at large, that's a slightly slower cadence that's a little bit more thoughtful, forward-looking, and I'll spend a little bit more time talking about that shortly. But it's been to try and take the sort of the pace of that and actually speed it up and take this vision that we have for what the white space looks like and sort of accelerate through it. And to do it not just in print, but across the Bloomberg ecosystem.
Okay, so tell us a little bit, I mean, you know, Businessweek magazines, legacy media, how do you remain relevant? How do you deal with the digital world, the mobile world? How does a great brand like Businessweek get through this disruption?
Honestly, we're blessed by being part of the Bloomberg ecosystem, right? And Bloomberg acquired Businessweek 10 years ago from McGraw-Hill. That acquisition, I think, speaks to a couple of things. One was, Mike was actually in City Hall at the time of that acquisition. I know you know some of the details of the acquisition really well. What Mike, I think, ultimately felt was that Bloomberg, as a company, at that moment in time, really meant Wall Street. And that Businessweek meant something bigger than Wall Street. And so he viewed acquiring Businessweek as a way of expressing Bloomberg as a bigger company that had a bigger reach than just being a Wall Street brand. It was the story of American capitalism, frankly. And I think that has been a really important thing to keep in mind because I'm not in the business of totally talking about Wall Street day in, day out. Bloomberg News can do that really well. There are bigger business stories that I want Bloomberg to tell, and we view Businessweek as the best place to do that. So I view it as, and I think Mike does as well, how does the portfolio as a whole fit together? Can we do it on mobile? We have a property called TikTok. We have TV that's nonstop, all of our social channels. We have a newsroom that's unlike anything else in journalism right now. We've got 3,000 plus journalists around the world in different bureaus, which that should be the biggest advantage that we can possibly have. And if we're not making use of that at velocity and at scale, then I'm not doing my job.
All right, so this is the topic of tonight's thing is my life as. Not that you have such a long life, you're so young.
I'm 38, yeah, I'm getting up there though,
so,
right?
Now, you got a long time. Well, this stuff is... Thank you. So I just want to go back a little bit over your career. I mean, it's interesting that Joel today is the editor of a major business publication, but you started at places like ESPN, Men's Health, Men's Journal. Tell us a little bit about that. What did you learn about your experiences there, and what do you apply to that in terms of your current position?
It's an untraditional arc, I think. I went to the University of Oregon. I majored in journalism. I graduated in 2003. The journalism school there at the time had an emphasis that I picked, which was magazine journalism. You could literally do that. There was TV or video or advertising or newspapers, and something about magazines captivated me. Ultimately, they were about stories. And stories, to me, it's one of the things that I've come to realize, I think it makes us human. And we've been telling stories around campfire for millennia, actually. So I think there's this innate sense of belonging that campfire analogy provides. And if you think back to the primal sense, like if you didn't like somebody's campfire and the stories they were telling, you'd leave and go find somebody else's. And I think that the media landscape is effectively sort of that, only now because you're scrolling through feeds, those campfires you can interact with in milliseconds, right? Only some of them are ones that will require maybe you to subscribe to interact with it. And that is like a fundamental shift that I think we're watching happen in media right now. But at the end of the day, it's always been about audience, to bring it back to that campfire thing again. How well do you know your audience? How well can you tell stories? So I came up through men's magazines doing, frankly, what's called service journalism. And the goal of that exercise is, how can you bring information or advice to an audience that they can interact with, maybe take the page, literally rip the page out of the magazine and apply it to their life. And if you do that well, maybe you immediately benefit from it. Like, I think a perfect example of this right now, the New York Times cooking presence is phenomenal. Everything that they make, they photograph it really well, and it's a recipe that I want to put in my Instant Pot and immediately try. That's great service journalism. It's something that you can immediately benefit from. And something like that, I think when you do it really well, you keep coming back to it again and again and again and again. And as a content maker, effectively you're thinking about it in a way of thinking about franchises. What's the franchise that I can come up with that looks like a wheel? And then you just keep putting more and more content into that wheel, and you let the wheel roll as long as you can. So that service journalism is sort of where I started my career with. And Men's Journal had a lot of travel and gear. I started as a gear editor. Men's Health.
You were a gearhead.
I was a gearhead. We would test bikes and tents and everything. And Men's Health became much more about health and fitness and personal health and relationship health. And so I was very good at that part of it. And at ESPN, I got good at something else, which was storytelling and longer form journalism. Along the way, when I was at Men's Health, I kind of learned that almost everything you can make into a health story. And at ESPN, I learned actually, there's a lot of stuff you can tell as a sports story. And when I came to Bloomberg, I realized ultimately, it took a while, but everything is actually a business story. So what we do at Businessweek, I view as ultimately everything I look at, there's a business story in here, in disguise. But I'm going to tell it in a way in Businessweek that feels like pop business. It's not going to be a Harvard Business Review case study that feels like brown rice with a side of spinach. Sorry, that was a little jab. Harvard, I think they can take it. But it's going to feel like a little bit more approachable and not something that talks down to you. And that's the pop business spirit is something that I've really tried to lean into.
Tell us about the best story you've done to date at Bloomberg Businessweek, and as importantly, what's the biggest story today in business?
Okay, one of the things you'll learn when you take an interviewing class with me is you only ask one question at a time.
Go ahead, hit me.
So I think that the beautiful thing about business is that it just never ends. Like we'll all go to sleep tonight and we'll probably wake up and there will be yet another big story, whether it's something in the trade war, which I think is probably the most significant story of the year, if not the decade. we're at a moment in the business cycle that companies are, 10 years after the financial crisis, we're just seeing a lot of crazy stuff start to happen. The IPO story this year, I think, has been one of the most remarkable. WeWork has been just an amazing little story to watch evolve over the last month. So I think you're only as good as your next story. And to that end, like, we're just constantly trying to look into the future and put balls in motion all the time about stories we're curious about. I don't want Business Week to feel like something that you're ever like looking back all the time with. I think an anticipation of the future is a much more interesting place to play in. And I think about this in part. I was at ESPN, and we wrestled with, our main competitor at the time being Sports Illustrated, right? And Sports Illustrated at the time would put Tiger Woods winning the Masters on the cover, and it's like you look at that product and you're like, I watched the Masters last week. Why do I need the magazine that told me that Tiger won? And instead, ESPN would try and do college football preview, NBA preview, NHL preview. And the essence of that was you as consumer or educated sports fan want to know what's going to happen, what's to come. And so what's next? I don't want to just tell you what the news is. I want to help you make sense of the news and spin it forward.
So what's next? What's the next thing in business coming down the pipe?
We love talking about recessions. That seems to be a thing that people are very curious about right now. So I think like the thing about business journalism is that people can, like, it's like a dog with a bone. Like, you give them something like that, and it's like, it might, the yield curve inverted. It might take 30 months for a recession to happen. And for every one of those months, you're going to hear about the likelihood of a recession literally around the corner. So you're going to hear about that for sure. I don't know how much value I can add or my people can add to that. And that's the other thing is, like, I don't have all the answers. I went to the University of Oregon, like I said. Ken Kesey was sort of one of the heroes on campus. And I had this Ken Kesey poster in my room in college that was a quote that was effectively, and if you don't know who Ken Kesey was, go read Tom Wolfe. But his quote was, go plant a strange garden where strange flowers can bloom, and relish in that, because people who say they have answers, don't trust them. Life is all about the mystery. That was a terrible paraphrase, but it stuck with me because I just want to ask questions, and that's the beauty of being a journalist. All we do is ask questions to people in power, or people running companies, or normal people. And those questions are driven by curiosity. And so it's this ongoing quest to sort of understand the human experience in the world that we live in. And then to do that basically with Bloomberg at your back at velocity is a true honor, right? So I think of it's less about what I can come up with than what a newsroom of 3,000 really capable journalists can break, cultivate, develop, and ultimately come together around. So I try not to be bottom down so much as top up in sort of my interaction with our newsroom.
So
I let them tell me where we're going to go.
So that's a good segue. I mean, we live in a world of partisan news today, right? And nobody would have ever thought that this would take hold in the way that it did, say, 10 years ago. So where are we? What happens? Where do you and Bloomberg Businessweek stand on that issue of partisanship in news media?
So we really pride our newsroom in being, I think, and this is funny. Like I live in Brooklyn and Fort Greene, and we were walking home from brunch, my wife and I and our 4-year-old son, Saturday, and literally I got stopped on the sidewalk by somebody who said, "You were just on TV. You're the editor of Bloomberg Businessweek." Doesn't happen that often, but it happens, right? And I said, yeah, and he goes, man, I gotta thank you. You guys are the only sane voice in news right now. And I think that is actually what we're trying to do on a small level, is like, we're not gonna take sides. We're just going to cover news as news happens. And we really want to be independent about how we do that. And I think that the trust that, that readers have in us is absolutely dependent on that. So the rest of the ecosystem may not come to the same conclusion. And I think obviously it's very fractured, and the Foxes of the worlds and the MSC and NBCs of the world have their own take on that. I don't watch either, but I do think that it's all about audience, right? If you think about it through that lens, people are catering to different audiences with different languages. Maybe not always with the same journalistic integrity that we try and pride ourselves at Bloomberg, but if you think about it through an audience lens, I think it begins to make a little bit more sense. So to that end, I think another element that's the backdrop of all this is look, the traditional way of doing journalism, and this is how you and I know each other also, it's like Mike was a publisher at Bloomberg for a long time, was an ad-driven model, right? And that means it's effectively subsidized by advertisements. And as I said earlier to the classroom, it's not like we live in a world now where 90% of digital ad revenue either goes to Facebook or Google, right? It's not like an advertiser wakes up in the morning and goes, I'm gonna buy print today. Those days are gone. I think there's advantages to them still, and we'll continue to see it because I think we have a really loyal readership model. And again, it's all about that campfire thing. So if you can have a campfire where you can also sell advertising, great. But the difference now is that we're in a place where we can have a subscription-driven model. And readers, it turns out, are actually willing to pay for good content. And so Bloomberg, a year and a half ago, introduced a paywall. In some ways, the Bloomberg terminal is the ultimate paywall, right? $22,000 a year to have a Bloomberg terminal on your desk. And there's north of 300,000 of them. That's an incredibly powerful tool. If you know how to use that tool, it is the most powerful financial tool in the world. And a lot of our content is exclusively for that user, right? But some of it can have a broader appeal. For instance, we have whole stories that are generated by algorithms. Those stories are literally only for people who have a Bloomberg terminal on their desk. You might not even be able to make sense of them. They're not even written for you. Some of them are written for other algorithms, I think. But in a human world, we can curate that experience and put a wall there, and people are going to pay for it. And that allows us to compete with the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, the Economist, all these different models that I think have also either, most of those have had historic paywalls, and now we're able to compete with them in a whole new way and go steal market share from them too.
So we're entering, a presidential cycle. We're in it, right, at the moment. How did the students here begin to decipher between fake news, partisan news, and come to their own determinations on where they stand on the issues at the moment? I mean, I think this is maybe the biggest, issue today in journalism, and I'm just curious how you can help the students here get through,
I think it starts by reading a lot from a lot of different sources, and even sources that you might not trust innately. And by actually, I think, trying to hear from a lot of different perspectives and being open-minded, but still asking really hard questions, I think that starts to set it up in a different way than we've approached this before. There's a lot of sources that you should just not trust, right? But I also think that there are new ones that maybe should be taken into account. So I don't think it's not like a blanket statement that we can apply across the top, but if it sounds too good to be true, if it looks like a bot gave it to you, if it trolls for your attention in ways that seem untrustworthy, I think there's a deeper sense that most of us have that something nefarious might be going on. And as an educated society, it's on us to be able to weed that stuff out.
You talked about storytelling before.
And to fight for the truth.
Yeah, important. I think it's more important than it's ever been. Credible news sources that you can trust. So
and to that end, like, if you're willing to pay for it,
right.
It's probably worth $5.
Yes, which is
or
rare.
or more.
Right. So
maybe $22,000 more.
So we talk about storytelling. You're a storyteller. Tell us a little bit about how to tell a story. Is it a craft that you can learn over time? Is it something that's sort of innate and you're born with? I mean, I'm always interested in the ability to communicate and connect to people, and storytelling is at the heart of that.
Funny, I have some slides that might help make this
It's got
point.
slides.
So we begin every story like this. A blank white page. And that can terrorize some people, and I try and approach it as a gift. We can do anything we want with this white page. We can let it be a white page. We can fill it with words. We can make it be an infographic. We can build it so that it's an animated video that blows you away. But it all starts just with, like, what are we trying to say? So I took over Bloomberg Businessweek, and effectively am given blank white pages that I get to do anything I want with every week. What's going to make Bloomberg Businessweek different than Bloomberg News and different than the rest of the business landscape? That was my strategic challenge. And so I came up with this thing that I call the matrix. And the matrix, 4 quadrants, intended to be the lens that we look through in pursuit of reaching our audience, who I define as business leaders. What can we offer a business leader looking through this lens? Number one thing, I think strategy stories are the white space in business journalism. What's a strategy story? Amazon is kicking everyone's butt. What are you doing about it? How is your business model different? Is it working or is it not working? GE, how do you take the most iconic, chuckle, right? How do you take the most iconic company in the history of American capitalism and effectively drive it into the ground? Because that's kind of what's happened. At the same time, we did that story a year and a half ago. Later on, a new CEO shows up. Maybe the only CEO in the country with a background in conglomerates who could actually maybe pull off a turnaround story. What's his plan? To me, those are strategy stories. And they are similar to a Harvard Business Review approach, except that the Harvard Business Review approach, it's like they're just getting around to writing about Enron.
Right.
I want to talk about all the businesses that you guys know, like, now. And I want to be doing it week in, week out at a cadence that you can only do when you're actually moving stuff like we do. Making sense of news and noise. I think about it as connecting dots, but rather than looking back, I want us to be trying to look forward whenever we can. I think about that service strand that I came up through. How do I help you become a better business person? How do I help you lead a better business? And if you're Mike Bloomberg, how do you build a better world? I think that's a powerful place that our brand can play in. That's not the same thing as Bloomberg News. Bloomberg News is about, I exaggerate here, the newsroom excels at stock up, stock down, new guy in, new guy out, this happened, that happened. It's a lot of what. And the space that I want us to be in, and Bloomberg News is also getting very good at this as well, is the how and the why. That is what allows us to take stories forward. And then the last thing is surprise and delight. Because if I do those first 3 things, it feels a little earnest. And if I can fill you with a sense of wonder or shock and awe, that's a really fun place to be. But if you only do that last quadrant, you're called the New Yorker. And I'm called Bloomberg Businessweek. So I have to mean business And sometimes these quadrants don't live in isolation, right? Sometimes a story can hit all the quadrants. There's a story that we did a number of years ago called, way before me, I take no credit for this, called What is Code? Cover-to-cover issue about how code is changing the world. It actually hits all the boxes. So my joke with the newsroom and my staff is, you come up with an idea that hits all the quadrants, I'll give you the whole issue, and I take the week off. Our stories begin on the cover. For everything that, all the chaos in the magazine world or the media world as a whole, the cover of a magazine has this amazing ability to kind of cut through news and noise still. So we really value that. And when I took over, I kind of did an autopsy, and I felt that the staff had actually deprioritized what the cover was capable of. So we feel like we have the strongest magazine covers in the business, and sometimes they look like this. That does not look as good as it should, but how to fight big tech. And that is a mask that was designed to scramble facial recognition technology. If you don't think the stuff in Hong Kong is important right now, that story is incredibly timely and harrowing. Old Wall Street, New Wall Street. This was a finalist for the best cover, magazine cover last year. The fine print, if you can't read it from back there, is big changes at the top. Lloyd Blankfein is number one on top, and then his successor, David, not helping me out there with the name, but heir apparent, David Solomon. So this is Goldman Sachs, white ivory tower of Wall Street. And they have a change in leadership a year and a half ago. And we had a plan for the cover that week, and then this happened. It is the biggest story on Wall Street. There's no way that we can not touch it. And we came up with something, my art department just gave me 2 bald heads. And I had to come up with the line that you write to make it work. And it becomes totally iconic. And I think about it as this message that you get to connect dots between editorial, photography, and design. And there's this little love fest that can happen when those 3 forces come together. We move headlines all the time at Bloomberg, 64 characters. You get this story in a fraction of the time that it takes to read a headline. And the power of it is like, you're gonna remember it long after I've shown it to you. It does so many things on so many different levels. There's the Wall Street story, but there's a class story. There's a racial story. There's a gender story. And yet it's in total less than 10 words. And to that end, I think part of what we try and do with the cover, how do we take something that's incredibly complicated and distill it down to its most simple form? LaCroix. I love stories about brands that have like cult followings. And LaCroix created a category out of nothing. Sparkling water. This is like carbonated water. They turned it into a multi-billion-dollar business. And in doing that, it like woke up Coke and Pepsi. And Coke and Pepsi were like, yeah, we can do that too. And if you look at it, the share price has totally plummeted since Coke and Pepsi came out with their product. Or our McDonald's cover that we did last month. In an age of kale salads and fake meat, McDonald's has a new secret sauce. Big data. We will do special issues a lot. I think this is something that we really look forward to. The periodic table of elements turned 150 years old this year. We took the whole issue, cover to cover, and devoted it to the periodic table. Because every element, all of them, are business stories. And that's what I mean about everything is actually a business story in disguise. You can't have electric vehicles without lithium. Right? So like, how do we Tesla, for all of its stuff, like you can't do it without an electric battery. Or what about Party City, which had to close dozens of locations because they ran out of helium. There's a helium shortage. And so what I love about covering business is that I try and look at the world through a lens of problems and solutions. Entrepreneurs do this all the time. an entrepreneur's solution to a problem is business. So lo and behold, two guys found this like gigantic helium supply in Tanzania. And now they have to get it from a rural place in Africa to market. How do you do that? Right? That's the story of business. Last year we did a space issue. One of the things I've learned from you is that people really like to learn about making money. And this story was about a guy who cracked the horse racing code. Another thing that I think we do that's different from Bloomberg News, we basically make movies. And this is like a movie waiting to happen. And it's a guy who, in the 1980s and 90s, was in Hong Kong and was using computers to figure out which horses to bet on. Literally made $1 billion, and now he's a philanthropist in Philly. Can you trust generics? Nope. That's a frightening story. Like, truly, what our supply chains look like right now, we don't know where our drugs are coming from or what's in them. And because of that, the FDA and Congress even don't know how to talk about this story. It's frightening. This was about 1.5 years ago. Note the asterisk. Very fine print. Risks and sanctions abound. Proceed with caution. Past performance may be indicative of future results. Investors may lose everything without recourse. We did this at the same moment that the summit in Singapore was happening. And I looked around and it was like that great moment. Everybody's showing these handshakes between our side and their side. And I was like, I've seen all that. Like, this is ultimately a way of talking about a frontier market that, let's be realistic, isn't going to come online anytime soon. But there are people who specialize in frontier investing. What do they say about North Korea? So we did a little package about that. Cambridge Analytica happens. How can you not talk about that? Delete my account. Facebook's nightmare. So we did this off of a New York Times marvelous story over the weekend. Had a plan for the cover. My life is actually, I could boil it down to like a Mike Tyson quote. Everybody's got a plan, and then you step in the ring and get punched in the face. Strategy stories are our plan. We're always planning on them. Many of them have news angles, but news is a relentless punch in the face. That was one that led to us realizing that we had an Instagram story in the works that we immediately accelerated. And we published this the morning that he went to the Hill. Instagram has a Facebook problem. And while he's testifying, Zuck is testifying at Congress, somebody asked him, Congresswoman, do you know who Palantir is? Not grammatically correct, so I rephrased it, because we had an investigative story about Palantir that had been in the works for a while. Do you know Palantir? Because Palantir knows you. And then a year later, we came back to him. You kind of can't get enough Facebook right now, right? Like the apology machine, and then this was all code that online actually was animated, so you see it scroll. So that was another way, and there's other videos of, most of these covers actually do have animation involved, so when we do them online and post them on our social accounts, like they have their own life. Print can have one life, but there's a digital expression that means Businessweek. That's another one. Couldn't talk about Boeing, not talk about Boeing this year. This was actually a cover that we'd been planning on doing this forever because it was tied to a 1-year anniversary of the Cambridge Analytica thing. But then Boeing's planes start falling out of the skies, and we had to talk about that. But I also didn't want to put that one in airports. So this was a Newsstand cover, and that was one that went to subscribers. On any given week, I'll do a cover that might only go to Europe or the US or Asia, and we're doing that constantly. Be global with a unique US perspective, but speak to your audience regionally. I love this one. I just have a really creative director. YouTube and then YouTube's cleanup plan. It's a big garbage fire with all kinds of little hidden Easter eggs. Back to things that we've been talking about all year. We did that cover back in March. maybe February. Unicorn Crossing, a special breed of company, won't be special much longer. This is about unicorns leaving the private markets to go public. Or case in point, WeWork, which tried to go public and then had to kind of walk that back. We did that story months before anybody else was scratching at WeWork. So this is one that I think I learned a lot about, which we do a lot of investigative stories. We have people who are reporting on certain bodies of work for a long time. This story had impact. It's about it's about a confessions of judgment clause that small business owners were signing unknowingly, usually when they were getting small business loans, and it set them up to basically have the people who were lenders seize their assets. So we had a body of work that was coming, and we launched that body of work with a cover story. This ended up winning a Loeb, and the New York State actually has outlawed this practice now. So it's all in service of something. When you can have impact and change policy through journalism, this would have been disrupting hundreds of lives had our reporting not actually brought it to light. It's also animated, which is fun because it goes cash advance, sign here, lose everything. Which they had their story, which we had edited and worked on forever, and they didn't have a headline. And I read it over the weekend and was like, the name of the package is sign here to lose everything. And they were like, oh my God, that's amazing. Where'd you come up with it? I was like, better yet, we're gonna make this sign. So we actually called some people who make neon signs in a hurry in Chinatown, and they made it in a hurry for us. Show you guys that one. This being an example of impact last year, I feel like this generic story that we've been owning all year is going to be another one.
So I want to just make sure we have time for Q&A. Anybody have questions? I think we have mics on both sides.
Yeah, I hear you get extra credit when you ask a question.
Yes.
No, but they ask a damn good question.
Oh, good
Oh,
question.
it's got to be a good
All right.
question.
And you give thumbs up, thumbs down? Okay.
Can you put the lights on so we can see who's talking to us?
Go ahead. Try it
Is that
again. Okay, now it's on.
To ask, you mentioned Google and companies like Amazon before. Do you feel that calls for breaking up such big companies will prove fruitful or not at all?
So I think this is going to be a theme that you're going to hear a lot about next year. I think antitrust is going to be a theme of 2020. It's one that we're really interested in. I mean, I just don't think that there's going to be as big of a theme next year, except for the election, probably. What makes this, it's not like it's the first time that this country has dealt with antitrust conversations. But what I think makes this moment unique is the number of different forces that are going to come to bear on it. And that is something that previous examples of tech companies like Microsoft in the 90s, nobody saw this level of scrutiny. To have it come from the state level and DOJ and FTC all at once, like that's going to be a different conversation. So I can't pretend to know what that outcome looks like, but I can tell you that we haven't seen those forces on this yet.
Can you talk a little bit about your process of finding the root of your stories and kind of going into breaking your stories? Like, where do you start to break the story about the newest business? Do you go to the owner, or do you go to people on the street, or where do you go to kind of break that story?
So it depends on what the story is. I think one of the unique advantages of Bloomberg is that I get to have this newsroom that's constantly looking for stories. And some of those might be like, where's the money going, right? And so SoftBank has been really interesting because they've been, they had a $1 billion fund that they created, right? That led to, them investing in WeWork. Sorry, 100 billion. Huge, huge. We've never seen anything like this. So instantly it's like, where are they putting that money? And what do we know about these people? And what else can we find out about it? And that's a big example, obviously, because it's a big number with some interesting personalities behind it. But we're constantly doing that with private equity, VC, institutional investors that might be, allocating capital to give pensioners a retirement. So all of those things come down to, where's money flowing and where's it going? And when you look at that, then you can basically start to scrape away at it. But like what a PR person tells you is news might not be news, right? So you have to, as a journalist, do the due diligence and go scratching in all the places to figure out what the story is.
Yeah, well, sorry, just like where's...
The Bloomberg terminal. All the answers lie there. $22,000 a year.
Go ahead.
But,
We're going to go back and forth here. I just want to make sure.
And, even a balance sheet can reveal something, right? So documents are a great place to start. Interviews are a great place to start. Primary documents, right? Primary sources. Yeah.
How you doing? America, China, and the EU have been in an arms race for producing artificial intelligence. My question is, how do you think narrow artificial intelligence will affect the role of a reporter in the coming decade?
Great question. So the view that I think we are coming to is that there are certain things that algorithms and machine learning can do so much better than humans, right? Like look across data sets and connect dots in ways that like the human brain is probably pretty good at, but like maybe not as good as some of this stuff. At Bloomberg, we have algorithms that are machine learning based running constantly, and they are moving stories all the time for our customers. And like I said before, like some of those might be like a stock moves outside of its Bollinger Band and that triggers an alert, or trading velocity spikes on a given stock. Humans aren't writing those stories anymore. They're like 20-word stories that algorithms are generating. But everyone, hidden in there might be a bigger story. So by using machine learning as a place that like it's gonna do a ton of stuff that a human maybe used to have to do. But now my time can be better spent by actually going and doing bigger reporting. So I think there's a symbiotic relationship that we're still very early with. But I think that's where it can go until AI can write narratives. And then we're all screwed.
I just want to make sure we get through, Lynn.
Yep.
So you were saying how right now you're based mostly print. So I was wondering how you see it. Do you see it becoming less print and more online based?
I misspoke. I mean, we live in a world where we move stories first and foremost to the Bloomberg terminal. Everything we publish goes there first, and then it's delayed and will appear online, and then some of those end up in print. So that is kind of a completely different way than the one I inherited. Because we don't live in a world that's print first. You're digital first. You want to interact with it. And then, but I'm always looking at the data to be like, what insights are here that I can learn from? And one of the things, like all the stories that I've shown you right now, one of the things that's different about all those stories are engagement. An average story that we look at from Bloomberg News, like it's a headline, right? So somebody comes to it and clicks out. Sometimes that engagement is very short. We make flypaper. It's stories that come and you like stick with, and like long after you've read it, it sticks to your ribs. There's a deeper, bigger story there. Those are the ones that we take pride in.
Thank you.
Hi.
So my question for you is actually about the rise of digital content in business news, specifically with multimedia and digital video. So TikTok by Bloomberg is still technically relatively new since it was only launched almost 2 years ago, compared to like companies like BBC and New York Times and even Wall Street Journal. And considering that the business reporting falls under one of the two topics that are as hardest to understand along with science reporting, do you think that Bloomberg is technically behind on the digital era? And do you think that business journalism would be better understood and even received if we use more multimedia to better explain why business stories are important and even data news is important to consume?
I don't understand the question.
So, sorry. So do you think that Bloomberg needs to be more advanced and push more digital content in the sense of video journalism to kind of have readers better understand data reporting and business reporting?
Okay, I mean, I think we're good, and we're only going to get better at it. And I think a lot of this goes to audience. Like, we can keep making, in journalism in general, you can keep doing what you've always been doing, or you can adapt to where the marketplace is heading, right? So, like, what we're doing in print, like, I don't know how long we get to do it. We'll do it as long as it's relevant. But constantly being able to reinvent yourself and having resources in place to do it means that you do create something like our TikTok, which is not the same thing as the Chinese TikTok, right? TikTok with C's, not K's. That is a mobile-first general news platform, right? That's a huge bet and gamble for us that we're learning a lot from. We have a whole digital video team and a podcast team that, we just did this podcast called The Shrink Next Door. That was a joint partnership with Wondery. And, that was really interesting for me because it's like long-form storytelling, but not in print, as podcast. That made a ton of money, and the rights became really valuable. That, to me, is something that's interesting, and we'll continue to like experiment in all these places until we feel like we know exactly what we're doing, and then we can scale it.
Thank you. Yes?
So you've worked for a lot of different companies, and you're talking about sports, but now you're doing business. And
Yep.
I was curious, how do you make that switch, or how do you even have the knowledge to be able to sort of confidently and strongly speak about what you're writing about, especially if it's something that you maybe never had an interest in, like when you were younger or in college?
So I think this is one of the things that I've learned about being a journalist. Like, it's okay to ask questions. And if you're curious about something, you can just keep asking questions. And if you keep reading and you keep writing and you keep talking to people, you just get smarter about something. So I cannot pretend to know all the answers. When I came to Bloomberg, I literally didn't know anything about business. But then you just start learning about it and asking questions, and you just kind of slowly start chipping away at it. But the thing that I think maybe I'm a little bit different on is that I've just always loved story. And I've also worked with people in a way that's, I just want to ask questions of reporters. Be like, what are you working on? And sometimes, especially at Bloomberg, like, there's a lot of people who are really close to a story for a really long time. And we cover things as incremental news a lot. And this is true of just newsrooms everywhere. And one of the things I try and do is come in and like breathe fresh new life to something and say, okay, you've written about it before, but like, can you tell it to me in a different way? And maybe I can help you tell the story. And that story language to me is the thing that makes me a little bit different. It's like, how do I help you tell a story that you can't look away from? And that feels like as you're reading it, there's this string that keeps pulling you through it. And then you get done with it and you kind of never forget it. Mm-hmm. That's something that whatever I touch, that's what I try and do. That's how I try and add value.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep.
I think we have time for a couple more questions.
Extra credit's going to run out.
Please.
I know you mentioned that you sometimes have specials, like the periodic element. But like, since your magazine is mostly focused on business, have you ever gone through extra steps to make your articles interesting for people not interested?
So we try and actually, because that emphasis on story, we try and have everything feel, it's not a business story. It's a story that happens to be about business. So I think if you read some of the stories, you'll come away feeling like, I didn't even know that was a business story. That's actually one of my goals. And that's why like something like the periodic table of elements, nobody else is gonna like be like, I'm gonna devote a whole issue of a magazine to the periodic table, right? Like, I still have PTSD from high school chemistry class, but I chose to make a whole issue of a magazine about the periodic table. Because I felt like it was a way of talking about business that was different than you would otherwise get. Yeah.
Thank you.
When you were talking about the 4 quadrants.
Yep. That was secret sauce, by the way.
That's Don't tell anybody about that.
Well, How would the four quadrants be applied to anything else other than business?
Well, it's not supposed to, because it's what makes Bloomberg Businessweek, right? And we can still do stories that don't maybe fall in one of those quadrants, but for me it was a way of identifying what the brand was ultimately about. And the brand was, it's called Bloomberg Businessweek. It's got Bloomberg in the title and it's got business in the title. What does that mean? And it was my distillation of what it means. So I don't think you could probably, maybe you could take it elsewhere. I don't know, I haven't thought about it, but it was a way of saying this is what makes us special. That isn't just breaking news. You're not coming to Bloomberg Businessweek for breaking news. You're coming for something else. So what is that something else?
So basically, it's only exclusive to the business side, not anywhere else in Bloomberg.
And you got to pay for it. Yeah.
You mentioned that you occasionally send different versions of the same paper to different countries.
Yeah.
Do you use different strategies for different countries to like grab the audience's attention?
So I think about it, again, how do you have a global reach? But how can you speak to somebody locally, right? One way that we can do that is via the cover, right? And so we will do the same magazine globally, but then I can change the cover if I think that Hong Kong is more important in Asia right now than it is globally, right? And ultimately that's an editorial decision, like we did Hong Kong globally when we did it over the summer. But it sort of comes to like an editorial decision of like, what story do we want to put out in the world? Everywhere. IPOs, that's sort of a US stock market story, right? That unicorn cover. So I knew I wanted to do that here. I could have probably done it globally because it's about, companies like Uber going public or, WeWork not going public, right? So it had a global language to it, but I also, that same week, I had a cover about Meituan, which is this Chinese delivery service, food delivery service, that's basically in this like really expensive trench warfare with Alibaba. And I actually felt like that was a better international cover than the IPO one. So we did a split where I did a US cover and an international cover. So it kind of comes down to like, what do we have? What have we planned for? But it's always something I'm thinking about. Yep.
Hi. So my question is similar to one that was posed just a couple minutes ago. How do you feel, having worked at many different publications, that you as an editor have taken what you learned about appealing to different audiences and apply it to Bloomberg Businessweek and anything else you may work on?
So I think it comes back to the audience thing. Who's this product for? Who's this website for? What's this Instagram account? Who's this for? And then how can you speak to that audience in a way that nobody else can? How can you use the data that you get from your storytelling to inform what future stories you're going to do? So again, I think about it as little campfires, and what makes that campfire different than that campfire? And then how can you excel at it? How do you know what makes a story right for one place but not for the other? And I think, as consumers, you should be thinking about these things too, because that helps you distinguish one from the other. And then when you're, to a point that maybe you want to apply for jobs, it helps you make sense of the marketplace.
Finish the question.
Yeah.
On your Bloomberg covers, you had the What's Next cover, and I was wondering, how do you know what's hot before it's hot?
It's a great question. So when you get kind of immersed, I think, in, for me, it's been Bloomberg, it just feels like there's this zeitgeist that is right over here almost all the time. And I think one of the things that I've learned is that you have to kind of like know what it is and be willing to reach for it. And I think that there's been cover opportunities that we haven't done that have also felt very zeitgeisty. And we did them as stories, maybe not as covers, but like Impossible Burgers and Beyond, that became very buzzy, right? we've known that for a while, that those companies were around, and yet now they came to market and like gathered investor appeal and went public and ran out of product. Like those are things that generate interest and enthusiasm. So I think there's a soft answer to your question that's sort of like, you kind of just know it when you know it. And usually, somebody's got a buzz quality that you can just feel like this is gonna be money. And that's also when you have to like tap the brakes, because there's been a number of stories that some of which have, blown up for investors. I'm thinking of Theranos, right? That everybody drank the Kool-Aid, and or so it seems. Where it felt like this is going to be huge, right? And yet it was bullshit.
Hi. In the context of business, are the best stories you find, or stories that find you?
Both. It's always different. Every story is different, right? So there's no rules for any of that. Whatever's a good story, I'll take it. And sometimes they find you, and sometimes you find them.
Yeah, 2 more questions, and then we have to.
So for as long as I can remember in school, we learned that the New York Times is the most bipartisan paper. So would you say that the Bloomberg Businessweek recently became more bipartisan, or?
No, I don't. I think it's been. We've been the same as always. I mean, Mike's changed political parties a number of times, but the newsroom has always been independent. So that's where we come down. Yeah.
You talk about narrative a lot, and how do you find the best way to, well, I mean, in any narrative you seem to kind of be forced to elect a protagonist in each story. How do you go about not being too biased while still not becoming just news, as in what?
It's a great question. I could teach a whole class on this. What makes narrative special is, and I actually...
It's no clocks. Oh.
There's a commercial called Mean Joe Green. You remember this?
Oh, yeah.
1979. I will end with it because it is a 1-minute video that is effectively the most perfect story narrative you can have. And it's a commercial. And it's driven by change. Something changes in the commercial. There's a before state and an after state. And the beauty of what Coke figured out was that at the moment of change, we're going to put our brand there as the catalyst for change. So narrative, good narrative, is about recognizing that there's a change, boiling the story down to its simplest form of like, what is the change? And it's not just events on the timeline. I would juxtapose it with this other one from 1981 with Sugar Ray Robinson. They have the same ingredients. You have a star athlete, a kid, and a soda. This one is a story. This one is ingredients that are all the same ingredients, but it doesn't come together. And I would ask you, why? And it's about change. Nothing changes in the 7-Up one. Everybody's just hanging out, having a good time. But in stories, something changes. And to help identify what change looks like, you have to appreciate there's a before state and an after state. And then, as a storyteller, my job is to elicit emotional responses to events on a timeline. And you do that by asking questions. And they're questions about how you feel. Not about events, because I can get those from looking at documents or whatever. But like, so you're an all-star pitcher and you threw your shoulder out. How did that feel? Oh, you discovered a new pitch that allowed you to save your game and expand your repertoire, and you got a chance to come back. How did that make you feel? How high can you make the highest highs, and how low can you make the lowest lows? So when you go through reading a story like that, it feels like a roller coaster. But the whole purpose of it is like, what was the change?
Emotional contrast.
Not contrast, but reaction, right? So a timeline is a series of events. This happened, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. That's news. When you tell a narrative, it feels like there's highs and lows.
So you're trying to find like what's going in between, like the therefore.
Yep. And the guy who taught me all this, John Sawatsky, he was at ESPN when I was there, whose job was to turn jocks into journalists. And he did it solely through teaching you how to ask questions. And when he taught me this, he said, it don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. That's what story is about. And that's why people come back to Campfire still.
I think it's a great way to end it. Sorry we can't take the rest of your questions, but you'll get extra credit anyway. We'll make sure. All right. Thank you to Joel.